Good afternoon. My name is Megha Agrawal Sood. I am a fellow Boulder citizen, and I spend a lot of my time working with independent artists all around the globe. It is an honor to share space today with the poets of the Multiverse, and Waldman, Rohan Chhetri, and Reiland Rabaka, and all of you in the audience. So this session today is going to have a bit of a different flow from some of the other lovely conversations that have taken place at the festival over the weekend. This is going to be a joyous celebration of craft. We'll kick off the session with each of our internationally recognized and award-winning speakers sharing some of their pieces, followed by a brief dialogue amongst the four of us, and then of course opening it up to the conversation to everyone in the room. As we get ready to kick off this multivocal poetry session, let's settle into our seats, get some of our wiggles out, silence our phones, please truly actually silence your phones, take a few deep breaths, and be present as each of our esteemed guests illuminate different frames for us to understand the world around us. Our first guest, who I want to welcome up to the microphone, is no stranger to JLF, Anne Waldman. She is a cultural shaper as her craft manifests through being a writer, editor, teacher, performer, magpie scholar, infrastructure curator, and political activist, and also an active member of the Outrider experimental poetry community. Anne has deep roots in Boulder, including co-founding the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at Naropa University and getting arrested at Rocky Flats alongside Allen Ginsberg and Daniel Ellsberg. As one of her peers noted, Waldman's work is the antithesis of stasis. She is a flame. Please help me in welcoming Anne Waldman.
Thank you so much. Glad to see some of you again and any newcomers, and looking forward to this terrific event. Hearing more from my friends here on stage. So I thought I'd just a shout out to the women in this festival. All the guys have been great too, but it's a kind of heart-ear expression. And with also so many of the younger poets I encounter who identify in different ways, but I have to use this just feeling we're so under attack these days as women. So you're going to hear, the fairy queen thrown out there, pagan Angelina. So it's a heart-ear ritual. We are being tested, sorceresses, and the fairy queen drink from a magic cup, poetry's liquid love. Elijah's floating chariot to the moon, when everything lost on earth is to be found. Pagan Angelina and her shepherd and sisters restoring sanity and wild mind. Is that a contradiction? We are being tested. I'll stretch out heart to the rail splitters, the bold sisters. They are being recorded. Posterity is dream, and I'll swoon to poetry, that dream in survival dancing. Not Hollywood Babylon, but nights of stamina and strangeness. The sisters mount the stage, imagination to the cope and cores of language. Beautiful, human, watching the world turn. And this next is for the Dalai Lama, and it's called Chenrezig Walks Among Us. So I feel humble just reading something for the Dalai Lama. He was invoked the opening session with Pico Air. You might have heard that mention of Dalai Lama being one of his favorite figures, people, and the work he does. And he came to Boulder. He came, I believe, twice, and he was at the Boulder campus in the heart center of town, and he came up to the stupa and so on. So Chenrezig, as is said, is meant to emulate as the Dalai Lama. And Chenrezig is the Tibetan term for the legendary Avalokiteshvara. He's emanating the Dalai Lama, the Karmapa, other high lamas. An etymology of the Tibetan name, Chenrezig, is spyam, eye, ras, continuity, and zig, to look. So this gives the meaning of one who always looks down upon all beings with the eye of compassion, who looks down upon sound, hears the laments of the sentient beings seeking help, seeking release. It is now understood that was the original form. It is also the origin of Kuan Yin, perceiving sound and cries, a translation further notably to use the variant Kuan Shi Yin, who perceives the world's lamentations. So we continue to do those. To the Lord who looks down, this bodhisattva is variously depicted and described and has a kind of beyond the binary energy, male, female. Some people say, well, is that, when they first teach it, is that a man or a woman? Swept away all suffering, gathered it up in a quantum leap, sucked it up till it returned. And when he looked back over his shoulder and saw all suffering come back in a great wave, all suffering riding and filling up nooks and crannies and crevices and templates of the world, all suffering, filling neurons and quarks and leptons, troubling minds of fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, all children and lovers, all sentient beings suffering, toxins of passion, aggression, ignorance in the middle of the night, strapped in demon mind, nowhere to hide, when all pounding suffering rides in and mind splits in 1,000 pieces. Chenrezig wept and head split in 1,000 pieces, and mighty red fire Buddha Amitabha leans in and puts the puzzle back together, wires it with tantric thread, adds some extra arms, extra heads, a conglomeration of tendencies, this wisdom body to rid the world of all suffering. More arms and heads take charge. Build it better, a deity, to maximize power of bodhicitta, to ease all suffering. And now Chenrezig will have more arms in all directions of space with numerous accoutrements. And under those arms, 1,000 hearts, better to banish all suffering of Tibet, of India, Nepal, of Pakistan, stateless Rohingya, wherever his crystal island, whatever map of suffering he alights on, keep emptying Europe, USA, empty of suffering, Israel, Palestine, empty, oh empty, China, Russia, Syria, Japan, Haiti, Yemen. 11 heads with 11 third eyes and more wisdom bodies in all the pores of his body. Thousands and thousands. Chenrezig walks among us, humble prince toward all systems of empire. Chenrezig walks among us as all constituent forms, precious ink, diamond scepter, skull cup of blood, thigh bone trumpet dissolves in mind, and lotus at his feet rises again through cracks of a concrete city or charnel grounds, eternal war. Starflowers shoot at dark of a distant galaxy, anywhere out of this world. His heart is that big, and Dharma gates are endless. He enters every one of them. Typhoons and famine dissolve. Emptiness as form to come back at you. Blow back is love come back you. At you the multiverse moves in the night that never sets. And is it cold out there? Is it cold out there? Will Tibet be liberated on Judgment Day? And China come to peace, and planet not royal with dystopia and ghosts of hunger? And will relight the butter lamp caught out in panic of the dark age? Banish the syndicates of samsara, put away your texts of doom, turn the wheel again in our frail Anthropocene. Chenrezig walks among us, and no identity endures, yet bodhisattvas are ever active. Invisible elves, swirling shamans, shape-shifting wizards every hour dedicate the merit. No end time here, but aspiration to press harder, Don't tarry, don't tarry, don't tarry, don't tarry. Keep trying, sweeping all suffering away, all pockets of the multiverse. Keep thou with mudra, with mantra, every mala bead a thought for others, golden thread of enlightening in every step, in all directions of space. Push, push against the darkness, push, push, push against the darkness, our Cartesian doubt, our quantum dimensions to worry, worry, while Dharma bends in all dimensions simultaneously, and extinction is nothing but the extinction of all suffering inside the extinction of self, whose form is emptiness. To power of compassion, Chenrezig walks among us, scientist of compassion. Push, push against the darkness. Push, push, push against the darkness. Push, push, push against the darkness. Push, push, push against the darkness. I once watched His Holiness in the Rockies, his helicopter like a ephemeral dragonfly descend to the great stupa of Dharmakaya. He came towards us, radiant vision of compassion in the shimmering autumnal light. Thank you.
Next, we have the writer, poet, and translator Rohan Chhetri. A Nepali Indian poet, being immersed in his works, it is quickly evident that he is not one to be limited by pre-existing notions and frameworks. His unique style fluidly moves between the past, the present, the future, the traditional, the avant-garde. One review of his work shares, "The textures of his language are undeniably beautiful. He is someone who knows how to take a personal story and make it into a myth that will last." His love for language has evolved in his practice, and as he just translated the first collection of Nepali poetry in English. Please welcome to the microphone, Rohan.
Wow, that was transformative. Thank you so much, Anne. I want to start with thanking Sanjoy and JLF for putting me on this stage with Reiland and Anne Waldman. Anne, I've been reading for a decade, a little more than a decade, and Reiland, I hope to discover your works more. I first heard Anne Waldman read in Bombay in 2010. I was a 19-year-old poet, and Anne Waldman was reading with the Bombay poets Adil and Jeet Thayil. And it was a transformative experience then, and here 14 years later, I still feel that energy that I, as a young poet, the voice and the presence that I took home, and that helped me hone my own voice in the next decade. With that, I'm going to start with, thank you. I'm going to start with a sestina, of all things. I wrote this poem in September 2021, but the images in the poem started haunting me really through the second wave of the Delta variant, COVID Delta variant in India, and the ravages of it, particularly in Delhi that summer, where crematoriums were overfilled and public parks were turned into these literal charnel houses, and for lack of space. And there were hundreds of bodies flowing in the Ganges, and bodies were being buried in shallow graves on the banks, and all of that just sitting in an apartment in Houston and having to see all of these in the places, in the cities that I've lived, was incredibly paralyzing to me. Hence acedia. Acedia, of course, meaning listlessness, one of the deadly sins, sloth, but also it's also called the noonday demon, the helplessness. That's where I derived some idea for this poem from. But India, where poets and activists are routinely jailed and languish in prisons for speaking out, for writing a poem, for being activists, this poem, I was really thinking of language made to perform under duress, at this intersection of veil and reveal. So I chose the form of the sestina because its formal demands are oppressive and as arbitrary as the nation state. And something about its dark music, I think, brings up the dead at noon in broad daylight. This is called a Acedia sestina. How now to rig the petrified words to reveal the infinite in a new permutation of language. How to green again the fallow bandwidth of talk when fire is funeral and river means hearse. When a syndrome grows precise in the panic blue air, where weaving death's black wing, a muted swarm descends, an empty swing. Uproot the new park benches to reveal cindered bones, the phantom smell of burnt hair watering the mouths of the wretched. Gauge his strength as the naked king pulls the black hearse of myth through jaundiced streets, bragging its width. In the shallow arms of the prison cell, a width of man's breath can keep his body warm. A flap of wing means sky, to be executed without a hood. As the hearse pulled fair of the nation's dead reveal, froth drying in the mouth of his language. The king's men upholster the king's velvet chair. Pitch to the injured core, his rabid hosts feed the bandwidth. A fear that plugs the old fault line prunes language to the dull blade of history's axe swing. What the news stifles, the river unveils. The shallow graves of sand, the watery hearse. On the shore, the stray dogs of my nation rehearse a new hunger. Heat drags in the air what a flanked disturbance of crow's flight reveals. A bloated corpse, twice its living width, strangled in a bush. A ballooned arm like a black wing, fastened to what has no face in language. The dogs were feeding off this language, this purple delirium washed up in a hearse. Then the keening vultures begin to descend, their wings unpedaling like something extracted them midair. I had to remember this, wake and find the width of my body bound to this boat for the tidal reveal. At high noon, where the width of each sad shadow's wing dwarfs. I did not rehearse this. I had no guide to veil the language for what was killing us out of thin air. Thank you. I'm going to read a short poem from my very latest book, and this is a book of translation of the Nepali poet Avinash Shrestha. And it's very special to me because it's, of course, as Megha said, it's the first selected poems volume of a Nepali poet to be translated into English, introducing the rich tradition of hope. I'm hoping it will introduce and open a door for the rich tradition of contemporary Nepali poetry into English. This poem, and I'm going to be reading in Nepali and then in English. This poem is called Kaya Kalpa, which I've translated as metamorphosis. Kaya Kalpa. नदीलाई अङ्गालो मारेर निर्धक्क निदाउँछु र बिउझदछु निस्सिम समुद्र बनेको हुन्छु रातभरि विपनामा झुस्किरहेको जुनीमा घस्रिरहेको थिए अहिले मध्य दिनको सपनामा रङ्गीन पुतली फेरिएर उडिरहेछु म मैमत परपीडक तर दीर्घायु काँडा थिए हिजोसम्म कुनी कुन निष्ठुरीले झारिदिएछ मलाई फुलको क्षणिक कायामा प्वाक म जथाभावी उडिरहेको छु बतासको बुई चढेर अनि चरा बन्ने आदिम आकाङ्क्षा हुर्काइरहेको छु आत्माभित्र म मात्र बिउ छु आज मलाई राम्ररी थाहा छ भोलि ईश्वर मैबाट टुसाउनेछ हेरिराख The poem's called, translated as Metamorphosis. Embracing the river, I fall asleep unafraid, and when I wake, I become the boundless sea. All night, I crawled awake in the lifespan of a caterpillar. In the afternoon dream, I've transformed into a butterfly in bright air. I was arrogant, cruel, but an imperishable thorn until yesterday. Someone heartless has dropped me in the flower's brief body. A feather, I drift wherever, piggybacking on the wind. In my soul, I desire, a primitive desire to be a bird. I'm only a seed today. I know. Tomorrow, you watch. God will sprout from me. I'm going to make this quick since we have 7 minutes. Lastly, I'm going to be reading from my book of poems, Lost, Hurt, or In Transit. Beautiful. I'm going to read 2 poems. There are 4 sections in this book, and the book is modeled as a kind of descent, a kind of katabatic descent, wherein a live man sort of goes into the underworld to bring up some form of knowledge, to inform the living in the overworld. The first section of the book is called Catabasis, and the last section is called Grief Dear. The last section of the book is modeled on a kind of coming out into the light and what is normally called anabasis. So this first poem that I'll be reading is called The Singing Bone. The shaman comes to the valley after midnight, circling our boarding house. Pinned to our small beds in terror, we listen to the clean music of bones. Later, through a rift in the curtain, we squint into the mist, but cannot see the past from a man blowing the trumpet of a suicide's hollow shin bone. 20 years will pass before I understand this music, robbed from a grave. Sleepless in the new world, listening to the laboring salt trucks making rounds on the frozen streets, it will come back to me all at once. The echo chamber of the creaking bamboo grove where we smoked our first cigarette. The army of deaf and mute in the village who spoke only in obscene gestures. The lonely daughter from the herbarium who wrote letters to us in a hand scrawl. The old house replaced by something modern. Architecture standing in for a woman's death. Her husband's slow breakdown, coursed for months. The clocks telling him to jump off a cliff. The second marriage hurried in mourning. The white seed of lunacy sleeps, then swells to its fate. But all our fears of summer snakes and rabid dogs, everything depended on them granting us safe passage through fields redolent with the smell of semen after a night of rain. Caught in the downpour, we stood under eaves of caves. The wind churned some vegetation pushed up, lightless from the silver blue mud. We hollowed hovels out of lantana brambles, where we spoke in the voices of already grown men. In winter, I traveled down as the coiling roads of the world grew dark. I held my insides, bile-soaked, where joy trembled, prospect of home washed in the retch of anxiety. My history of nausea in the cold half-light of childhood, where did it come from? Mother, or the long descent in the old manor of hell, the asphalt frozen, slippery all the way home. The shaman returns the next morning for alms, turmeric, rice, strip of black cloth. We circle him, the mystification undone in daylight. Just a man bruised from the cold, with children starving somewhere in the mountains across the border, as we sit here, goading him to reveal to us the singing bone. Thank you. I'm going to finish it off with the sonnet, which is, as I said, a kind of a coming out into the light after the course of the whole catabasis that the book is supposed to be. And mezza voce, of course, you're feeble, you're speaking in a half voice by the end of it. All summer, the half voice lurked behind me, and I played deaf for days, for to live, to not write about it, to use my body, part the river's flesh to operate. Machinery is human too, to love, and for one stay awake through it all. Now it comes like the deer sleeved out of the green in clean staccato, all corpuscle and hunger. No, not the deer. The ravens calling for the wolves to split open the light from the dead deer's belly, jeweled in the dark purse of its pelt. We are each given heaven for brief, so heavy we put it down, dance small around it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan, for both sharing your work and the work of Avinash Shrestha. What a gift it was for all of us to hear it both in Nepali and English, so thank you for that. In closing out this round, we have Reiland Rabaka, a professor at University of Colorado, whose influence has quickly expanded beyond the borders of the classroom, including spearheading the efforts to establish the Center for African and African American Studies at the university. A self-proclaimed radical pacifist, through his unique point of view and style, his work has made significant contributions to the African American musicology and critical theory. And without a doubt, he has the best shoes at the festival. Let's welcome Reiland to the microphone. On both days.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm honored to be here. I don't want to take up too much of the time, so I'm just going to stay here right now. It's an honor to share the stage with you, Anne and Rohan. This means a lot. The piece a lot of my work is really based in music because I am a musician. And so you may hear some elements of free jazz or avant-garde jazz, blues, funk, soul music, reggae, Afro beats. I could do this all day, but I'm not, I feel like Miles Davis. I don't sit around and talk about what I'm going to do. I just do it. Whew. Anybody that believes in the power of prayer, pray for me. Oh, this is called We People Who Are Darker Than Blue. It is a blues funk poem, and I'm really into experimentalism, and so my poem has a preface. Here's the preface. It could be argued that the origins of funk can be traced back to the Middle Passage. The horrific 3-month voyages from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean that took place between the 16th and the 19th century, where an estimated 132 million to 165 million enslaved Africans were shackled and chained, treated inhumanely, and treacherously transported in the hull of slave ships en route to the Americas. Only 1 out of 12 enslaved Africans who entered those ships of horror and hell walked out of them alive on the other side of the Atlantic, which is to say, Only an estimated 12 million to 15 million suffering souls survived the Middle Passage. It was down in the odious and ghastly depths of the slave ships, surrounded by the stench and defecation, disease and death, that funk, not merely funk music, but funk culture, funk as a movement, funk as a form of rebellion against the established order, was born. There are historical reports that reveal that enslaved Africans sang songs during the months-long Middle Passage voyage. They sang songs from the various cultures from whence they came, and they created new songs about their despair deep in the hulls of the ships. They used their shackles and chains to create all kinds of rhythmic patterns, a plethora of polyrhythms, by clanking their manacles together, and against the wood boards and beams of the ships, a potpourri of rhythms reverberated from iron beating against iron and iron beating against wood. This was the first funk music, the melancholic music of the Middle Passage, and echoes of this music free floats through not merely our music, but our lives and struggles today. Our outer darkness covers us like a cloak, and Curtis Mayfield referred to us as we people who are darker than blue. Yes, blues people. Here is another one, another poem in honor of you. They do not know who we are or who we have the potential to become. Finger popping, hair locking, jay walking. More than half of us never get a chance to see the sun. We people who are darker than blue, hear me now, because I'm talking to you. I often think of the ancestors, those who died and those who survived, those who endured unspeakable hurts and horrors, and those who were brutalized and died while they were still alive. The blues and the funk mixes with red dirt and black blood, slave castles, doors of no return, and middle passages, buzzwords for things we don't know much about. Slavery, whips, shackles, chains. They have merely moved them from our feet and placed them on our brains. And I can hear Bob Marley solemnly singing, old pirates, yes they rob I, sold I to the merchant ships. Minutes after they took I from the bottomless pits. But my hands was made strong by the hand of the Almighty. We forward in this generation triumphantly. Won't you help me sing another song of freedom? Because all I'll ever have, redemption songs, redemption songs, redemption songs. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. In time, we must free our minds. Listening to Funkadelic, free your mind and your ass will follow. Inside, many of us, we feel so empty, so funky, so numb, so hollow. But this is not a song of freedom, not another ode to the way we wish the world was. No, this is a spoken song, mouth music about the here and now, about Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice, about Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor, about Eric Garner and Mike Brown, about crime and crack cocaine, about the prison industrial complex and substandard schools, about ghettos and barrios and Africa in America. No, this is not another freedom song. It is a funk song, a song of remembrance that gives voice to some of the things our ancestors might have said had they lived to see where we are now and who we are now. 21st century funk. I often think of the ancestors, those who died and those who survived, those who endured Unspeakable hurts and horrors, and those who were brutalized and died while they were still alive. Every night I kneel and humbly pray, and every day, century after century, more bloody black bodies are carried away. Black bodies drenched in the pathos and pain of the blues and the funk. Black bodies, blue black bodies that have been used and abused and abused and abused. Mass graves fill the seabed of the Atlantic Ocean. Bone bridges crisscross the ocean's floor. We went through doors of no return, no return, no return. And the hard, sun-scorched, sweat-drenched earth where they toiled cries out. The spirits of unburied, enslaved ancestors who did not make it through the Middle Passage summoned us. I'm so glad trouble don't last always. I'm so glad Harriet Tubman was not willing to accept the world the way it was. She speaks to us, and when we listen, Rosa Parks from the front to the back of the bus. Black bodies, blue, black people, those whom the world has for centuries forsaken. Blue, black people, those whom the world has for centuries ridiculed, robbed, and mistaken. Our outer darkness covers us like a cloak. And Curtis Mayfield referred to us as we people who are darker than blue. Beautiful blues people, here is another one, another poem, a tone poem, a spoken song, mouth music in honor of you. They do not know who we are or who we have the potential to become. Finger popping, hair locking, crip walking, Jake walking, sweet talking. More than half of us never get a chance to see the sun. We people who are darker than blue, hear me now because I'm talking, I'm singing, I'm just for you.
Wow. Wow. What a treat for all of us this Sunday afternoon. Thank you so much to each and every one of you for sharing your art with us. After experiencing those pieces, I'd love for us all to learn a little bit more about y'all's practices. I have so many questions. We only have 20 minutes, but I believe we can at least spark some inspiration today. So, Reiland, I'd like to start off with this question for you. During your panel yesterday on democracy, you mentioned that you believe the alternative to political violence is radical imagination. And it made me think about an excerpt from the author Amitav Ghosh, who wrote in his seminal book about climate change, where he said, "When future generations look back upon the Great Derangement, they will certainly blame the leaders and the politicians of this time for their failure to address the climate crisis. But they may well hold artists and writers to be equally culpable, for the imagining of possibilities is not, after all, the job of politicians and bureaucrats." So as an artist and as an academic and as a musician, how does radical imagination show up in your work?
I believe by blurring the lines between what it means to be an intellectual, an artist, and an activist. I'm not afraid to embrace my identity as an activist, and I believe that if anybody's really radical or environmental justice is inextricable from social justice, insofar as I'm concerned. So no matter what great cause we are committed to, I believe that environmental justice, environmental racism is going to be key, to be perfectly honest with you. There won't be a world for the patriarchs to practice patriarchy in if we keep going like this. There won't be a world for the racists to, and so the reality of the matter is that the green issue is an issue that I think is incredibly universal. And so I want to create work that brings people together as opposed to tear us apart. And I feel like, unfortunately, some people have confused the definition of politician with a destructionist or something. They're really sort of dividing a lot of folk. And so I want to create art that inspires and enlivens, One of the things that we do in the classroom, I'm teaching an introduction to hip hop studies class right now, and I turn my students on the eco rap. Yes, that's really a thing. You're looking at an eco rapper. You know what I'm saying? You're also looking at a feminist rapper and somebody who's fluent in queer and trans rap. And so what I'm trying to do is move beyond radio rap and gangster rap. And in my work, as you know, I've identified more than 100 forms of rap music. So I'm not going to see sort of poetry as this high art and then rap as the street art. You know, one of the things that I learned from the feminist art movement and the black arts movement of the 60s and 70s was, again, we have to make sure that we're not creating a bunch of artificial and arbitrary categories that don't allow us to be fully and freely who we are. And I think that we take a page out of the, you know, the queer and trans right movement when they talk about living out loud.
Thank you. And I'd actually love to hear some of your reflections expanding upon this theme of radical imagination and poetry. Because actually during yesterday's session with Reiland too, you had reflected upon what is the role of poetry in awakening us all to the world.
Well, it's always been important to me to get outside the sort of norms of, I mean, I'm very located when I'm located and working very much in community and so on, but kind of sense of a curiosity about things I don't know so much about. And I took on the Manatee Humanity Project. I've talked about that, the Borobudur, and these longer poems that are usually, you know, over 100 some pages that involve research and travel and that sort of thing. So the, you know, this idea of investigative, documentary, facts, you know, science that just opens things up more and more, and you realize you know less and less as you go on, and yet your mind is very vibrant with description and a kind of surreal layering. So I think that's very much the approach with, you know, this 1,000-page epic I wrote that was investigating patriarchy and war from a sort of feminist perspective, but included a lot of personal dreams and sections, and saw these sections as kind of cantos, as, you know, traveled and certain, you know, classical models of what the epic is and the telling of the story. I had quotation from my child who was very young and his friends. I'd hear them in the backyard talking about World War III, you know, 25 years ago or more, and that sort of thing. And then the very real, hard stuff of ecocide and how you know, how do you inspire people to that? I mean, the elements aren't caring about us, like, you know, we're messing with them, but the sun is not feeling angry, you know, one day at me personally, or and so on. So this idea of the narcissistic thing about the inconvenience always when you're traveling and everybody can't move and stuck in an airport for 48 hours and that sort of thing. Just trying to imagine beyond the kind of parameters and boundaries of where you, and try to work on rituals and kind of practices, if you will, from many traditions where you can actually close your eyes and be somewhere else. That old game with children where you press your eyeballs and you see a whole new world and vision. I like being around children because of that refreshed imagination. So, curiosity is the thing for imagination. And then I do feel we're walking around in a trance often. We haven't evolved yet. We're still in this sort of serotonin cycle of redundancy and why can't we get out of the fight flight, the kill survive, they're taking that away from me, and what is it going to take? Is it our consciousness that's limited? I'm interested in these advances with studying entheogens and the psychedelic programs that are now at Harvard, and Naropa's developing a therapy program around psychedelic research and so on. It's not a lab, and I think you have to be very careful with these things. But the point is just some way out of that vicious circle, and also paying attention. I was bringing up the kind of conglomerations of these tendencies toward power, greed, and so on, and how you have to go after, in a big way, finding whole countries and just some economic way. I mean, to break the capital O scene open toward, restitution and repair takes forever.
I think we all definitely experience that all three of your works very much beautifully spark curiosity. As I was beginning to familiarize myself with all three of y'all's expansive collective of works, I noticed there was a really common, beautiful theme around music that connected each of you, ranging from identifying as musicians, as collaborators with musicians, and also as writers who incorporate musical elements into your syntax. Rohan, I'd love to hear your reflections on how you explore the concept of music through your work.
Yeah, I really liked what Reiland pointed out about that he doesn't see that hierarchy between rap and poetry. I have a very good friend and mentor of mine, the Indian poet Vivek Narayanan. He's written his book called an epic called After, which is after the Ramayana, the corpus of the Ramayana. It's a brilliant book, but he talks about this. He says that rap is one of the last sort of repositories of rhythm and rhyme in English poetry, right? So it really connects to the idea of I'm always searching for that musicality now more than ever, where I find that equal music, which approximates the brutality of colonialism, the brutality of the kind of things, the violence that we are encountering, where just speaking about it isn't enough. I want my poems to be an event. I want my poems to make music which can subconsciously change things rather than just having it in a logocentric, in a sort of message-based form. So I'm always looking for that. My current project, for example, is a book of sonnets, which kind of channels it's about the colonial history of the tea plantation in India, and I come from a tea plantation town in Bengal. And it's really looking at the indentured laborers, channeling through the voices of not just the indentured laborers, but also the British managers, and later on the Indian managers, under whom the conditions, became worse in some cases, and the kind of deprivations that they were sort of living under, and the kind of the perimeter of the tea garden and the figure of the manager becomes so central because you cannot get out of the tea garden. And the sonnet as a form was interesting to me, to have that 4x4 space where I could channel those voices and kind of approximate the music, or approximate a kind of restriction, the kind of torque of language where I could bend and break. And Brathwaite talks about how in Nation Language, in the essay about Nation Language, talks about how the slaves learned to untune the language when forced with the restrictions of not having to use the language, their own language. They kind of untuned the language and made it into a language undecipherable, or to the plantation managers, right? So I love that idea. I love that idea of untuning. I love that idea of bending. And I also believe that the music has this goes back to Eliot, who was talking about you can hear the poem and get it without even understanding the words. Maybe he was getting somewhere along these lines, but there is something about music that I like, which isn't straightforward, or which isn't just lulling you by the beauty of it, but there's something else that's happening, and that can psychically change subversively in a way.
I love the title. Oh, I was going to say.
Go ahead.
No, I was just bringing up Kamau Brathwaite, who came to Naropa some years ago, but his sense of tidal-lectics, I always love that. Yeah, okay. And it makes me think of some of the jazz, sort of similar kinds of things, this other kind of zone that you're listening to the elements around you. And I was using that a lot with the Manatee project, the sound of the water of these things. That sounds amazing, your project with the square, and Eliot. No, the challenge, I was invited to work on an opera by the composer David T. Little, and it was entitled Black Lodge, and originally it was Artaud in the Black Lodge, and the assignment was, because they were asking me to come up with a libretto, was they wanted William Burroughs, Antonin Artaud, and some kind of dance with that, and also how to work with Burroughs' story, his controversial story, and he was a friend, so that was kind of a challenge to work with material closer to you personally, and their key incidents, the episode of cutting off his finger, and they were very, David is classically trained, although he did work, so he worked with a string quartet, and he also worked with a kind of, I don't know, what is it called? I don't know all the names for the current style, heavy metal, but they were out on a beach somewhere and hammering away. And it wasn't exactly Barosian, but it was trying to bring in some heavy, a lot of heavy metal bands had named themselves after lines from William Burroughs. But in any case, this combination of, and Artaud, I was hoping there could be French, and I worked with an original version, but that collaboration with other, I think a lot of us work out of music just on our own, and so it was kind of a challenge. I would say, I don't know if I like that. I don't know what they're doing with my words, and that sort of thing. But it's great to see the concreteness that comes out of our work around music, what the intentions can be and the forms.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to actually expand upon this theme around colonialism a little bit. I mean, I think it comes up in, both Reiland and Rohan's, a lot of your work, both as like in terms of lived experiences, but also how it frames and influences culture too. And I'm curious about how, Reiland, this is for you. How do you navigate this creative tension of sharing your art in a way that is authentic to your voice, but also doesn't feel compromised for the white gaze? I know I've just basically asked you your dissertation.
I'm going to write another dissertation. For me, I see my work as decolonial. And so I think that I'm never going to compromise. Like, there are just some things I'm not going to compromise on. And so when you were talking about language, for me, there's a limitation in the English language to express some of the interiority, what the negritude poets would call Africanité. So that special part, let's say, of our humanity that may owe itself to, right? Again, there's always universalisms, as we say, Ubuntu, that we all share humanity, we all have to rescue and reclaim our humanity together. And if we don't do that, we will have perilous times like what we're living in right now. The coloniality, though, of the fact that we're having to write a lot of this, our work in the English language, which was used for incredibly colonial purposes, something similar could be said about Spanish, right? French, so on and so forth. And so for me, there's a kind of multilingualism that free floats through my work. And I also think that that's why rap music and hip hop culture becomes so important to me, because you're absolutely correct. I could have conversations with real hip hop heads where my grandmother, who's 97, and my mother would scratch their heads, right? There's no swear words. We won't even have to say the N word, right? And every time I hear the young people in my classrooms, when they say the N word, again, they're not going to say it in my class because, I'll eject you like I'm a referee. I'm actually thinking poetically that they should be turning inward. So instead of the N word, the N, you understand the word I'm saying. You actually be looking deep within, and I think that's where a kid who grew up in the projects, right? It was my meditation practices early on, prayer, obviously, early on, that allowed me to transcend. So I invoke transcendental meditation, save my life, right? And so it's a very powerful thing when you get in that zone where I can hear Sun Ra and I can hear late John Coltrane, right? Or even some Billie Holiday when she get ready to scat really slowly and quite beautifully. I mean, there's some things that I felt like Billie Holiday wanted to express that she couldn't put in words. And so when I focus on jazz diva scatting, right, and some of my work, I think that there's certain things that Ella Fitzgerald, like as you were saying, this white gaze on black performativity, And how do you stay your authentic self, even in the face of that? I'm thinking about Little Richard right now. I'm thinking about Big Mama Thornton right now. I'm thinking about Jimi Hendrix has to go to London in order to play rock and roll because they so identify a form that African Americans created with white folks by that time that you actually have to go somewhere. Come on now. And so for me, the musicality is also about, it's a way to introduce, for me, 18 to 25-year-olds to the beauty of poetry.
Yeah.
You know, when I point out that, you know, we can read Shakespeare's sonnets all day long. I'm trying to get them to sort of get into that. But when I hit them with some of that, some of that Kendrick Lamar, and the guy has a Pulitzer Prize. Here's a rapper with a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
So somebody somewhere else understands the profundity, the grandeur, the majesty, not simply of this music, but that it is poetry. And it's a poetry, a form of poetry that people, much like everybody in my family who don't have college degrees, I'm the first person in my family to go to college, they can get with what I'm saying if I read. It's kind of like Audre Lorde said, I could write a 300-page book, but the sisters on the block may not be able to rock with me. But if I write 3 stanzas of a poem, you got washerwomen, domestics, women working in factories and in kitchens and everything, you know, snapping their fingers and everything. I want a poetry that's accessible and that speaks to our modern moment, but also the future, because there's a deep futurity in my work as well.
Yeah. I feel like it's just starting to get really juicy, and we have a couple minutes left. Okay. But kind of just to round us out with one last question for each of you, and on this notion of introduction to poetry. You know, there may be some in the audience today who are just beginning to dip their toes into the beautiful, magical world of poetry, whether as a reader or as a writer. And I wanted to ask each of you for your guidance on how to best navigate it. So we'll begin with Anne, then we'll go to Rohan, and then we'll go to wrap up with Reiland.
Well, I think it's good to be curious about what's happened in poetry for centuries, and look to your own roots, your language roots from your family. Think about, rather than what's the most popular thing currently, and imitation can be helpful, but go to, your own sort of sources. Think about that and see what what have you been reading as a child. Hopefully you've been introduced to some nursery rhymes and so on. It was a nursery rhyme that got me interested in Buddhism, the one where the woman gets her skirt cut off and then her little dog doesn't know her, and which Gertrude Stein picked up on. So anyway, the little dog that doesn't know you, but what's familiar and moves you, something that kind of wakes you up. You feel like, I hadn't thought of that before. And then start reading. Reading is so important. Reading and enjoying reading, not feeling threatened or that you're not good enough, you're not as good as whoever. I remember in school it was Yeats or something. I thought, well, I'd love some of these things, but I'm not Yeats.
Yeah.
So anyway, starting with that and asking and seeking out other artistic types. People who want to listen, we used to have little reading circles. These things when I was younger and growing up in New York helped, and certain kinds of teachers one had. But get friendly if you have a teacher who loves, poetry. I remember, always, it's James Baldwin talks about his teacher. That's such a great, occasion. Teachers respond to that always. I feel like I respond to people who want to go further. Anyway.
Yeah. We have 5 seconds left.
Sorry. Come on.
I really am it's everything Anne said, of course. Read widely, read to the point where you push through the imitative phase, because the phase of imitation is very important. But also you kind of get out of that phase too, because at some point you just realize that a poetry is always supposed to be emergent. It's supposed to be something that has not been written before. And to find that, you always have to surprise yourself. You always have to push through. And I think, to reach that, it takes a while, but just read everything and push past that. But don't reject the imitative phase too. I think it's a very important phase to do that in the beginning. Yeah.
My 5 seconds. I don't say this publicly a lot. I often don't feel like I belong in Boulder. But But one of the things that I find incredibly beautiful about my adopted hometown, Boulder, Colorado, is that there are a lot of people who are not afraid to be bohemian. Obviously, I'm a little different, even compared to other brothers. I'm a little different, right? And Boulder often accepts me on my own terms, right? And so I would say write from your own lived experience, and your lived experiences are worthy, whether those experiences are grappling with a disability, whether those are lived experiences are immigrant, right, are indigenous, are feminist, or womanist, or queer, or trans, or whatever the situation may be, you are worthy, right? And so for me, there's going to be two things: self-worth. And once we acknowledge our self-worth, then we can begin to practice self-care. Self-care is the beginning of social transformation, right? Because when you start transforming yourself, then you can transform society, and those things are inextricable. Thank y'all.
Please continue this conversation with each of these amazing artists downstairs. And once again, let's give them another round of applause for sharing their art with us.
Thank you.